Good afternoon and welcome to Active Surveillance to Prevent Sepsis in High-Risk Areas. I'm Kathy Wareeye, founder of Infection Prevention Partners. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present here today. It's quite an honor to be among a group of such distinguished experts. Here are my disclosures. I do receive speaker fees from Cepheid, but other than that, I have no conflicts of interest. So I'm going to share with you over the next 15 minutes or so how active surveillance can be a very powerful tool for you to use to prevent sepsis and also to maintain a healthy ICU overall. So what I'm really going to focus on is the prevention of sepsis and doing that via early detection of the types of organisms that cause sepsis. So in a large European study, the investigators found that the most common organism associated with sepsis was Staph aureus, 30%, including 14% of which that was methicillin resistant. In another large study, it was found that in the ICU, the predominant infecting organisms were Staph aureus at 20.5%, Pseudomonas species at almost 20%, and Enterobacteriaceae, which was mainly E. coli, at 16%, with fungi at 19%. Acinetobacter was involved in 9% of all infections, and they found significant variation across regions, with a significantly higher proportion being Acinetobacter in Asia at over 19%. Now in India, the majority of the isolates are gram-negative bacteria, over close to 66% of them. Klebsiella pneumonia is the most common among the Enterobacteriaceae. And 50 to 70% of the organisms observed were carbapenem resistant. So multi-drug resistance in these organisms is also a primary concern. And then Chatterjee and his team found that the most common microbe in India was Acinetobacter baumannii. Moving to the right side of the slide, what I'm really going to focus on is this continuum, and the fact that if you work at the early stages of the continuum to prevent or detect very early on organisms of concern that can lead to sepsis, how you can reduce the clinical and economic consequences. Because we know as a patient moves towards sepsis, and then up through the stages of management and potentially acute management, that the clinical and economic consequences rise along with that more acute therapy. So as far as the role of active surveillance screening is concerned, active surveillance can be used in a number of ways. And when I refer to active surveillance screening, I'm referring to the testing of asymptomatic patients for the presence of a particular organism. So this is before patients have exhibited any signs or symptoms of infection. And active surveillance typically can be undertaken as part of an institutional risk assessment or determination of your baseline for a particular organism. Active surveillance is often performed on transfer of patients from a high-risk healthcare institution, so an institution where a particular organism is highly prevalent, or conducted on admission from a high-risk geographic location. Active surveillance is often conducted on admission to a unit such as intensive care. And when I refer to universal active surveillance, I'm referring to screening of those patients on admission. So this would be all patients screening on admission into an acute care institution. And once again, as I said, we really want to focus here on prevention of sepsis and on early detection of the organisms that can cause sepsis. And this is where the role of active surveillance is quite powerful in enabling us to do this. And we can also implement targeted infection control interventions quickly so that we ensure that those organisms are not transmitted to the environment or to healthcare workers or to other patients, thereby reducing, as I said, the clinical and economic consequences of these organisms. So I think perhaps the best illustration of the efficacy of active surveillance is in this look back to the mid-2000s when MRSA was rising in prevalence all over the world, and looking at what the United Kingdom did in response to that situation in comparison to the United States. So in the chart on the right, the US represents the gray line and the UK represents the orange line. And you can see there that in the early 2000s, the UK instituted reporting for MRSA bloodstream infections, and that this had an impact. About a 5% decline occurred as a result of that. But in 2006, they implemented a comprehensive national strategy, and one of the core components of that was universal active surveillance screening. So this was screening of all patients on admission to an acute care institution in the UK. And you can see what happened as a result of that. The prevalence rate just plummets. And as I said, this was a comprehensive strategy. Active surveillance was not the only component, but it was really the new component to the program, and I think had a tremendous impact on rates and the ability of the UK to achieve and maintain that reduction. Now, in comparison with the US and the gray line, we never did implement a comprehensive national strategy for containment of MRSA. And in comparison to the UK, active surveillance screening was subject to intense debate. We ultimately landed on different forms of screening of high-risk patients, but very few institutions actually undertook universal active surveillance screening. And as a result, MRSA is endemic in many US healthcare institutions. While rates have come down significantly, we've never really been able to achieve what the UK achieved. And a rather prominent patient safety advocate stated that if the effectiveness of the United States confrontation of the MRSA epidemic were equal to that of Northern Europe, that over 85% of the MRSA infections might have been prevented. So that's a tremendous comment in terms of the clinical and economic consequences when we don't control these organisms. So there were a couple of institutions in the US that did conduct universal active surveillance screening. And one of them is the US Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration is one of the very largest healthcare institutions serving veterans across the United States. And in 2005, they enacted a comprehensive screening strategy, which included screening of all patients on admission, so universal active surveillance. They also screened them on movement between units and prior to discharge. And if you look at the right side of the infographic in the red box, you'll see that by 2017, as a result of that, the Veterans Affairs Department was able to reduce MRSA by 55% and also reduce MSSA, susceptible staff, by 12%. Now, in comparison, on the left side of the slide, the remainder of the US was able to reduce infections, but not as dramatic a rate, and they really leveled off in 2013. So this, once again, is an example of how active surveillance screening, in particular universal screening of all patients, can have a dramatic impact on prevalence of an organism. So if you were to implement a surveillance strategy for a multi-drug resistant organism, what would that look like? So at the point where you have yet to detect any cases, you would want to conduct periodic prevalence surveys. And this would mean taking a representative sample of your inpatients, including those in high-risk populations, for example, geriatric patients or patients in the ICU. You would want to screen transfers, for example, emergency department patients who have come in from long-term care facilities, or recent discharges from other acute care hospitals on admission, particularly those where prevalence of particular MDROs are known to be high. And you would do this perhaps with every third patient over a 1 to 2 week period, and you would continue to do that as long as your prevalence was low. You would repeat this survey at regular intervals. And at this point, if you were to use clinical cultures, that would be fine because time is really not of the essence when you have yet to discover any cases, or when you have no cases, I should say. So upon identification of the first case, you would want to implement active surveillance screening. And this would mean initiating screening at the first appearance of a positive test result at your institution or in your community. Because as we know, community prevalence is rather critical. These organisms don't know any institutional boundaries. And that program would typically encompass weekly sampling of the total target population and testing of newly admitted or transferred patients. And at this point, rapidly identifying colonized patients is rather important in that it enables you to quickly initiate infection control interventions, including contact isolation. Now, if you get to the point where prevalence is over 2%, you need to escalate your screening program. You would expand your active surveillance program to test all patients in these target populations, as well as patients transferred or admitted to the target population. And at this point, timing is even more critical. The institutions that have indicated success with an active surveillance program in terms of reducing prevalence have indicated that they have to capture a minimum of 85% of the total patient colonization days in contact isolation. So finding those patients quickly and getting them into contact isolation is what enables containment. And at this point, once again, molecular diagnostics can become a very important tool because of the rapid turnaround time. Now, in the US, our agencies have indicated that even when rates are endemic to epidemic, above 5 to 7%, that these enhanced control measures can significantly reduce colonization. So what would happen if you decided to rely strictly on clinical cultures? So waiting to test patients until they exhibited signs or symptoms of infection. Well, that would significantly impair your ability to prevent and contain the spread. And once again, because your program, by relying on clinical cultures alone, would apply interventions only to the known cases. All of the undetected carriers would exacerbate pathogen spread through lack of applied infection prevention strategies, such as isolation and contact precautions. So as the picture illustrates, you would only be addressing the tip of the iceberg if you relied on clinical cultures, the testing of patients once they have become symptomatic, as your only approach to these multi-drug resistant organisms, or the spread really of any type of infection. So this is a study that really illustrates that point. This was undertaken by a team at the University of California, Irvine, and what they did is they simulated the spread of carbapenem-resistant enterococci in a single county in California over a 10-year period, assuming that only clinical cultures were used. And so in the graphic below, the dark black lines indicate total cases, both detected and undetected cases of CRE. The light gray lines on the bottom indicate those patients that were detected through clinical cultures. And the dark solid gray area indicates all the patients that would remain undetected. And so with clinical cultures alone, the team estimated that by year 10, 70% of the daily CRE carriers would go undetected, that only 1 in 9 CRE positive patients would be isolated, leading to transmission and spread over time. So what about active surveillance as a strategy for a healthy ICU? Well, we know we want to prevent healthcare-associated infections, and particularly infections with resistant organisms. So active surveillance helps you know your baseline. It enables you to identify high-risk patients. It enables you to detect very early on your positive patients. It enables you to rapidly initiate infection control measures, such as contact precautions and isolation. That enables you to prevent transmission and spread. It enables you to reduce antibiotic consumption, and enables you to reduce antimicrobial resistance overall. So as far as active surveillance is concerned, it is a powerful tool to enable you to prevent infections that can lead to sepsis. It enables early identification of the infections that contribute to sepsis. It will also help you reduce time to targeted therapy, which will improve your outcomes overall, both clinical and economic. So what I'd like you to take away from this is that I'm for questions at the end of the panel.